Sara Martinez had always believed that fairy tales could come true. At 26, she had found her Prince Charming in David Rodriguez, a kind-hearted architect with gentle brown eyes and a smile that could light up any room. Their wedding had been a dream come true, held in a beautiful garden venue with white roses cascading everywhere, and Sara wearing her grandmother's vintage lace dress that had been carefully preserved for decades. But the most incredible wedding gift had come from Sara's mother, Elena Martinez, a successful real estate developer who had worked tirelessly for 30 years to build her empire. Elena had surprised the young couple with the deed to a stunning 4-bedroom house in the prestigious Willowbrook neighborhood. The house sat on nearly an acre of land, with mature oak trees surrounding the property and a wraparound porch that Sara had fallen in love with the moment she saw it. The house was worth over $800,000, and Elena had paid for it in full, wanting to give her only daughter the security and stability she had never had growing up. Sara's eyes had filled with tears of joy as her mother handed her the deed during the wedding reception, and the entire gathering had erupted in applause and celebration. David had been overwhelmed by his mother-in-law's generosity, and he had immediately gone to Elena to express his gratitude. He promised her that he would take excellent care of both the house and her daughter, and Elena had smiled warmly, telling him that she knew Sara was in good hands. For the first 2 years of their marriage, Sara and David had been blissfully happy in their beautiful home. Sara had transformed each room with loving care, painting the walls in warm colors, hanging family photographs, and creating cozy spaces where they could relax and dream about their future together. The master bedroom had become their sanctuary, with French doors that opened onto a small balcony overlooking the garden that Sara had planted with her own hands. David had set up his home office in one of the spare bedrooms, where he worked on architectural drawings for various projects around the city. Sara had turned another bedroom into a craft room where she pursued her passion for creating handmade jewelry, which she sold online to supplement their income. The third spare bedroom remained ready for guests, decorated in soft blues and whites with comfortable furniture that Elena had helped Sara choose. Everything seemed perfect until David's mother, Carmen Rodriguez, began visiting more frequently. Carmen was a 62-year-old woman who had raised David and his younger sister Maria as a single mother after her husband had abandoned the family when the children were young. She had worked multiple jobs to support her family, and David had always been grateful for his mother's sacrifices. However, Carmen had never quite approved of David's marriage to Sara. She felt that Sara came from a privileged background and would never truly understand the struggles that Carmen and her family had endured. Carmen also resented the fact that Sara's mother had been able to provide such an expensive wedding gift, something that Carmen could never have afforded to do for her son. At first, Carmen's visits were pleasant enough. She would come for Sunday dinners and occasionally stay overnight in the guest room. Sara had tried her best to make Carmen feel welcome, cooking her favorite meals and showing genuine interest in the stories Carmen loved to tell about David's childhood. David was always happy to see his mother, and Sara wanted nothing more than to build a good relationship with her mother-in-law. But as time passed, Carmen's visits became longer and more frequent. She began making subtle comments about the house, mentioning how different things were when she was young and how people in her day had to work much harder for everything they had. She would walk through the rooms with a critical eye, suggesting changes that Sara might make or pointing out areas that she felt needed improvement. Sara tried to dismiss these comments as harmless observations from an older woman who was set in her ways. She continued to treat Carmen with respect and kindness, hoping that time would help them develop a closer relationship. David seemed oblivious to any tension, simply happy that two of the most important women in his life were spending time together. The situation began to change dramatically when Carmen's daughter Maria found herself in serious financial trouble. Maria was 34 years old and had been married to a man named Roberto for 12 years. They had 2 young children together, 8-year-old Sofia and 5-year-old Miguel, and had been living in a small apartment across town. Roberto had lost his job at the manufacturing plant where he had worked for over a decade, and despite months of searching, he had been unable to find steady employment. Maria worked part-time as a cashier at a grocery store, but her income was barely enough to cover their basic expenses. They had fallen behind on rent and were facing eviction from their apartment. When Carmen learned about her daughter's situation, she immediately sprung into action. She began spending even more time at Sarah and David's house, using their phone to make calls on Maria's behalf and researching assistance programs that might help the struggling family. Sarah sympathized with Maria's difficult situation and offered to help in any way she could, including providing some financial assistance to help them catch up on their bills. However, Carmen had a different solution in mind. During one of her extended visits, she sat David down for a serious conversation about family responsibilities and the importance of helping relatives in need. She reminded him of all the sacrifices she had made for him growing up and emphasized that family should always come first, no matter what the circumstances. Carmen suggested that Maria and her family should move in with David and Sarah temporarily, just until Roberto could find steady work and they could get back on their feet financially. She painted a picture of how wonderful it would be to have the whole family together, with the children bringing joy and laughter to the house, and Maria helping with cooking and cleaning as a way to contribute to the household. David was torn between his desire to help his sister and his concern about how such an arrangement might affect his marriage. The house was certainly large enough to accommodate everyone, but he knew that having 4 additional people living there would be a major adjustment for both him and Sarah. When David presented Carmen's suggestion to Sarah, she tried to be understanding and supportive. She knew how important family was to David, and she genuinely wanted to help Maria and the children during their difficult time. After much discussion, they agreed that Maria's family could stay in the guest room temporarily, with the understanding that it would be a short-term arrangement while they worked on finding a more permanent solution. Maria, Roberto, and their 2 children moved into the house on a cold February morning. Sarah had prepared the guest room as best she could, moving in a small cot for one of the children and rearranging the furniture to accommodate 4 people in the space that had been designed for 1 or 2 guests. From the very first day, Sarah realized that this arrangement was going to be much more challenging than she had anticipated. The guest room was simply too small for a family of 4, and Roberto and Maria were constantly stressed about their cramped living conditions. The children, confused by the sudden upheaval in their lives, were cranky and demanding, often crying late into the night and disrupting everyone's sleep. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Carmen, who had promised to help manage the situation, instead seemed to fan the flames of discontent. She would arrive early in the morning and stay late into the evening, taking charge of the household and making decisions without consulting Sarah. She began rearranging things in the kitchen to suit her preferences and establishing new rules about how the house should be run. Sarah found herself feeling like a guest in her own home. Carmen would assign her tasks and chores, speaking to her as if she were a child who needed constant supervision. When Sarah tried to gently assert her position as the homeowner, Carmen would remind her that family was more important than property and that a good daughter-in-law should be willing to sacrifice for the greater good of the family. The situation became increasingly tense as weeks turned into months. Roberto showed little motivation to actively search for employment, spending most of his days watching television or sleeping while Maria worked her part-time job. The children, lacking proper supervision, began getting into Sarah's craft supplies and causing damage throughout the house. Sarah tried to discuss her concerns with David, but he seemed reluctant to confront his mother or sister about the growing problems. He would acknowledge that the situation was difficult but would ask Sarah to be patient, insisting that things would improve once Roberto found work and they could move out. Meanwhile, Carmen began making increasingly bold suggestions about how to better accommodate everyone in the house. She mentioned that the master bedroom was quite large and wondered if there might be a way to divide it so that Maria's family could have more space. When Sarah firmly rejected this idea, Carmen's demeanor began to change from merely pushy to openly hostile. The breaking point came on a sweltering July morning when Carmen arrived at the house earlier than usual and found Sarah sitting on the front porch with her morning coffee, enjoying a few moments of peace before the chaos of the day began. Carmen's face was set in a determined expression, and Sarah could sense that something significant was about to happen. Carmen climbed the porch steps with purpose, her heavy footsteps echoing against the wooden boards. She was carrying a large manila envelope and had the look of someone who had made an important decision and was ready to act on it. Sarah set down her coffee cup and greeted her mother-in-law with a tentative smile, hoping that perhaps Carmen had found a solution to help Maria's family move into their own place. Instead, Carmen sat down heavily in the chair across from Sarah and placed the envelope on the small table between them. Her expression was stern and businesslike, completely unlike the pleasant facade she had maintained during her earlier visits to the house. Carmen began by talking about family loyalty and the importance of making sacrifices for those we love. She spoke about her own childhood, growing up in poverty and learning the value of hard work and determination. She reminded Sarah of all the difficulties that Maria was facing and emphasized how important it was for the family to stick together during challenging times. Sarah listened politely, assuming that Carmen was leading up to a request for additional help, or perhaps announcing that she had found assistance for Maria's family through one of the programs she had been researching. However, Carmen's next words left Sarah completely stunned and speechless. Carmen opened the manila envelope and pulled out several legal-looking documents. She spread them on the table and began explaining that she had been doing research on property law and tenant rights. She had discovered that since Maria's family had been living in the house for over 4 months, they had established what could be considered tenant rights, and that Sarah would need to follow proper legal procedures if she wanted them to leave. But Carmen's demands went far beyond simply allowing Maria's family to continue living in the guest room. She announced that she had consulted with a lawyer friend of hers who had explained that since the house was a gift from Sarah's mother and had been given before the marriage, it might not be considered fully marital property under certain circumstances. Carmen's voice grew stronger and more confident as she outlined her shocking plan. She demanded that Sarah move out of the master bedroom and allow Maria and her children to occupy the largest and most comfortable room in the house. She argued that Maria needed more space for her family, and that as a childless couple, Sarah and David could easily make do with one of the smaller bedrooms. Furthermore, Carmen insisted that Sarah should consider signing over partial ownership of the house to Maria, arguing that this would provide Maria's family with the security they needed and would demonstrate Sarah's commitment to being a true member of the Rodriguez family. Carmen suggested that since Sarah's mother was wealthy and could presumably help Sarah obtain another house if necessary, this sacrifice would be relatively minor for Sarah but life-changing for Maria. Sarah sat in stunned silence as Carmen continued her demands. Carmen explained that she expected Sarah to make this transition gradually, starting by moving her personal belongings out of the master bedroom within the next week. She said that Maria had been suffering from depression and anxiety due to the cramped living conditions, and that having a proper bedroom would significantly improve her mental health and her ability to care for her children. Carmen also announced that she would be moving into the house permanently to help care for her grandchildren and to oversee the household operations. She said that Maria needed support from her mother during this difficult time, and that Carmen's presence would ensure that everyone's needs were being met appropriately. As Carmen spoke, Sarah felt a range of emotions washing over her. She was shocked by the audacity of the demands, hurt by the complete disregard for her feelings and rights, and increasingly angry about the manipulative way Carmen was trying to frame the situation as being in everyone's best interests. Sarah finally found her voice and told Carmen firmly that she would not be moving out of her own bedroom, and that she had no intention of signing over any portion of the house that her mother had given her as a wedding gift. She explained that while she sympathized with Maria's situation and was happy to continue helping in reasonable ways, Carmen's demands were completely unrealistic and inappropriate. Carmen's reaction was swift and fierce. She accused Sarah of being selfish and ungrateful, pointing out all the ways that David's family had welcomed her, and insisting that Sarah's refusal to help demonstrated that she had never truly committed to being part of the Rodriguez family. Carmen's voice grew louder as she spoke, attracting the attention of neighbors who were working in their yards nearby. The argument escalated as Carmen began making increasingly personal attacks on Sarah's character and background. She accused Sarah of being spoiled and privileged, suggesting that Sarah had never faced real hardship and therefore couldn't understand the importance of family sacrifice. Carmen claimed that David was unhappy in the marriage but was too kind to say anything, and that Sarah's selfishness was putting strain on everyone in the household. Maria emerged from the house during the height of the argument, having been awakened by the raised voices. Instead of trying to mediate the situation, Maria immediately sided with her mother and began adding her own demands to the conversation. She complained about the inadequate living conditions in the guest room and accused Sarah of treating her family like unwanted guests rather than beloved relatives. Maria went on to describe how difficult it was for her children to share such a small space and how embarrassing it was for her to have to ask permission to use various areas of the house. She said that the children were asking why they couldn't have a proper bedroom like other kids, and that she was running out of ways to explain the situation to them. Roberto appeared shortly after Maria, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation but unwilling to contradict his wife or mother-in-law. He stood silently behind Maria, occasionally nodding when she made particularly emphatic points but generally trying to avoid direct eye contact with Sarah. The children, Sofia and Miguel, also came outside to see what was happening. They looked confused and frightened by the adult argument, and Sarah's heart went out to them even as she felt increasingly frustrated with their parents and grandmother. She realized that these innocent children were being used as emotional leverage in Carmen's manipulative campaign. David arrived home from work in the middle of this chaotic scene. He had been putting in extra hours at the architectural firm, partly because of increased workload but also partly to avoid the growing tension at home. When he saw his wife, mother, and sister engaged in a heated argument on the front porch, with his niece and nephew looking upset and neighbors starting to gather, he knew that the situation had reached a crisis point. David tried to calm everyone down and suggested that they move the discussion inside the house. However, Carmen was too worked up to be easily pacified. She immediately began explaining her demands to David, presenting them as reasonable solutions that any loving son would support without question. Sarah watched David's face carefully as his mother outlined her expectations. She could see the conflict in his expression as he struggled to balance his loyalty to his family of origin with his obligations to his wife. Sarah realized that this moment would be a defining point in their marriage, and that David's response would determine the future of their relationship. David listened to his mother's demands with growing discomfort. While he wanted to help his sister and her family, he recognized that Carmen's expectations were completely unreasonable. He could see the hurt and anger in Sarah's eyes, and he knew that he had allowed the situation to go too far without properly addressing the underlying issues. However, David's response was not as strong as Sarah had hoped. Instead of immediately rejecting his mother's demands, David suggested that the family needed time to discuss the situation and find a compromise that would work for everyone. He said that emotions were running too high for productive conversation and that they should all take some time to cool down before making any major decisions. Carmen was not satisfied with David's diplomatic response. She had expected him to immediately support her position and pressure Sarah into compliance. She began questioning David's commitment to his family and reminding him of all the sacrifices she had made for him over the years. She suggested that his reluctance to support her plan showed that Sarah had turned him against his own mother and sister. Sarah felt completely betrayed by David's failure to stand up for her and their marriage. She had expected him to immediately reject his mother's outrageous demands and to support her position as the rightful owner of the house. Instead, she felt like David was treating the situation as a negotiation rather than recognizing it as an attack on their marriage and their home. The argument continued for another hour, with various family members repeating their positions and emotions continuing to escalate. Neighbors had definitely taken notice of the commotion, and Sarah felt humiliated by the public nature of the conflict. She realized that Carmen had deliberately chosen to have this conversation on the front porch, knowing that the public setting would add pressure to the situation. Finally, Sarah announced that she needed time to think about everything that had been said and that she was going inside to collect her thoughts. Carmen interpreted this as a victory and began making plans for Maria to start moving her belongings into the master bedroom within the next few days. Sarah went directly to the master bedroom and closed the door behind her. She sat on the bed that she had shared with David for over 2 years and tried to process everything that had just happened. She felt overwhelmed by the betrayal, the manipulation, and the complete disregard for her feelings and rights that had been displayed by David's family. As Sarah sat in her bedroom, she could hear Carmen's voice carrying through the house as she continued to discuss her plans with Maria and David. Carmen was talking about practical matters like moving schedules and furniture arrangements, as if Sarah's agreement was a foregone conclusion. Sarah realized that she was facing the most difficult decision of her life. She could either submit to Carmen's demands and allow herself to be pushed around in her own home, or she could take a stand and potentially face the consequences of a major family conflict. She thought about her mother's generous wedding gift and how Elena had worked so hard to provide her daughter with security and stability. Sarah also thought about her marriage to David and whether their relationship could survive this crisis. She loved David deeply, but she was beginning to question whether he would ever be able to stand up to his mother and put their marriage first. She realized that if she gave in to Carmen's demands now, there would be no limit to what the family might expect from her in the future. As evening approached, Sarah knew that she needed to make a decision that would shock everyone and demonstrate that she was not going to be manipulated or pushed around in her own home. She began formulating a plan that would turn the tables on Carmen's demands and show the Rodriguez family that they had seriously underestimated Sarah's strength and determination. Sarah spent the entire night awake, pacing around the master bedroom and formulating her response to Carmen's outrageous demands. She knew that simply saying no would not be enough to resolve the situation. Carmen had already demonstrated that she was willing to escalate the conflict and use emotional manipulation to get her way. Sarah realized that she needed to take decisive action that would make it clear that she would not tolerate any further attempts to control her or take advantage of her generosity. As dawn broke, Sarah had developed a comprehensive plan that would address not only the immediate crisis but also the underlying issues that had led to this confrontation. She understood that David's family had never respected her as an equal member of the household, and that they had taken advantage of her kindness and generosity for far too long. Sarah's first step was to contact her mother, Elena, and explain the situation in detail. She knew that Elena would be both shocked and furious to learn how Carmen was trying to manipulate the ownership of the house that had been Elena's generous wedding gift. Sarah needed Elena's support and advice as she prepared to take action against the Rodriguez family's demands. Elena listened to Sarah's account of recent events with growing outrage. As a successful businesswoman, Elena immediately recognized Carmen's tactics as classic manipulation and attempted theft. Elena had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to allow anyone to take advantage of her daughter, or to undermine the security that Elena had tried to provide through her wedding gift. Elena told Sarah that she would immediately contact her attorney to review the legal aspects of the situation, and ensure that Sarah's ownership rights were fully protected. Elena also offered to provide any additional support that Sarah might need, including financial assistance if the situation required Sarah to take legal action against David's family. More importantly, Elena assured Sarah that she had her complete support whatever decisions Sarah needed to make. Elena reminded her daughter that no one had the right to make demands about property that didn't belong to them, and that Sarah should not feel guilty about protecting what was rightfully hers. Elena also expressed concern about David's failure to immediately support Sarah, and suggested that Sarah needed to seriously evaluate whether David was truly committed to putting their marriage first. Sarah's next step was to quietly document everything that had been happening in the house over the past several months. She took photographs of the damage that had been done to various rooms, including stains on the carpets, scratches on furniture, and broken items that had been damaged by the children. She also began keeping a written record of Carmen's demands and the various ways that the Rodriguez family had been taking advantage of the household. Sarah realized that she needed to consult with an attorney of her own to understand her legal rights and options. Through Elena's referral, Sarah contacted Margaret Thompson, a family law attorney with extensive experience in property disputes and domestic conflicts. Margaret agreed to meet with Sarah immediately to discuss the situation and provide legal guidance. During their meeting, Margaret confirmed that Carmen's claims about tenant rights were completely unfounded. Since Maria and her family had been invited to stay as guests and were not paying rent, they had no legal right to remain in the house if Sarah wanted them to leave. Margaret also confirmed that since the house had been a gift to Sarah from her mother before the marriage, it was considered Sarah's separate property under state law, and David had no claim to ownership. Margaret advised Sarah that she had every legal right to evict Maria's family from the house and to prohibit Carmen from continuing her manipulative behavior. Margaret also suggested that Sarah consider obtaining a restraining order against Carmen if her harassment continued, and that Sarah should document any further attempts at intimidation or manipulation. Most importantly, Margaret explained to Sarah that she was under no obligation to continue tolerating the current situation out of concern for David's feelings or family relationships. Margaret emphasized that Sarah's rights as a property owner were clear and enforceable, and that no one could force her to give up her home or her security for the benefit of others. Armed with this legal knowledge and her mother's support, Sarah began preparing to implement her plan. She decided that she would give David one final opportunity to demonstrate his commitment to their marriage by supporting her position and helping to resolve the situation appropriately. However, she was also prepared to take independent action if David continued to prioritize his mother's demands over their relationship. Sarah's plan involved several simultaneous actions that would address all aspects of the problem at once. She would formally evict Maria's family from the house, prohibit Carmen from continuing her manipulative behavior, and force David to choose between his loyalty to his mother and his commitment to their marriage. However, Sarah also had a more dramatic element to her plan that would shock everyone and demonstrate the full extent of her determination. She realized that simply evicting the Rodriguez family would not address the fundamental lack of respect that they had shown for her and her property. Sarah wanted to send a message that would ensure that no one would ever attempt to manipulate or take advantage of her again. Sarah spent the next few days quietly making preparations for her plan while maintaining a calm exterior around the house. Carmen and Maria seemed to interpret Sarah's silence as acceptance of their demands, and began making more detailed plans for taking over the master bedroom. Carmen even brought measuring tape to the bedroom, and began discussing how the furniture should be rearranged to better accommodate Maria's family. David continued to avoid direct conversation about the situation, apparently hoping that the conflict would somehow resolve itself without requiring him to take a strong position. Sarah realized that David's avoidance was actually a choice in itself, and that his failure to support her was effectively the same as supporting his mother's demands. Meanwhile, Roberto had finally begun looking for work more seriously, apparently motivated by the increasing tension in the house and the realization that their welcome might not last indefinitely. However, his efforts were too little and too late to change Sarah's decision to implement her plan. The children, Sofia and Miguel, continued to be caught in the middle of the adult conflict. Sarah felt genuinely sorry for them and wished that there was a way to help them without enabling their parents' and grandmother's manipulative behavior. She realized that the children would ultimately be better served by having adults in their lives who took responsibility for their own problems rather than trying to take advantage of others. On a Thursday morning in late July, exactly 1 week after Carmen's shocking demands, Sarah put her plan into action. She had chosen this day carefully, knowing that Carmen would arrive early as usual and that David would leave for work at his regular time. Sarah wanted to handle the initial confrontation without David's interference, giving him the opportunity to see the results of her actions and make his own choice about how to respond. Sarah was waiting on the front porch when Carmen arrived, just as she had been the week before when Carmen had made her demands. However, this time Sarah was not alone. Margaret Thompson, her attorney, was sitting beside her, along with a sheriff's deputy who would serve the eviction notices and a professional moving company crew who would help remove the Rodriguez family's belongings from the house. Carmen's face went white when she saw the official vehicles in the driveway and realized that Sarah had taken legal action. She began demanding to know what was happening and insisting that Sarah could not possibly have the authority to evict anyone from the house. Margaret Thompson stood up and formally introduced herself as Sarah's legal representative. She explained that she was there to serve eviction notices on Maria's family, and to inform Carmen that she was no longer welcome on the property. Margaret presented Carmen with legal documents that outlined Sarah's property rights, and made it clear that any further attempts to harass or manipulate Sarah would result in additional legal action. The sheriff's deputy stepped forward and formally served the eviction notices, explaining that Maria's family had 24 hours to remove their belongings from the property, and that any attempt to remain after that deadline would result in arrest for trespassing. The deputy also informed Carmen that she was being issued a no trespass order, and that any future visits to the property would result in her arrest. Carmen was completely shocked by this turn of events. She had expected Sarah to eventually cave into pressure, and had never imagined that Sarah would take such decisive legal action. Carmen began shouting about family loyalty and accusing Sarah of destroying David's relationship with his mother and sister. Maria emerged from the house in her pajamas, having been awakened by the commotion outside. When she saw the legal officials and moving crew, she immediately began crying and accusing Sarah of being heartless and cruel. She demanded to know how Sarah could throw two innocent children out onto the street and claimed that Sarah's actions would traumatize Sophia and Miguel. Sarah remained calm throughout the confrontation, allowing Margaret Thompson to handle most of the communication with Carmen and Maria. However, when Maria began using the children as emotional leverage, Sarah finally spoke up and addressed the situation directly. Sarah explained that she had tried for months to be accommodating and helpful, but that Carmen and Maria had taken advantage of her generosity and had shown complete disrespect for her property and her marriage. Sarah pointed out that Maria and Roberto were adults who were responsible for finding housing and supporting their own children, and that it was not Sarah's obligation to provide permanent housing for David's extended family. Sarah also addressed Carmen's manipulative behavior directly, explaining that Carmen's demands had been completely inappropriate and that her attempts to intimidate Sarah had crossed every reasonable boundary. Sarah made it clear that she would not tolerate any further harassment or manipulation, and that Carmen's actions had permanently damaged any possibility of a positive relationship between them. The moving crew began systematically removing all of Maria's family's belongings from the guest room while Carmen and Maria continued to protest and make threats. Roberto appeared confused and embarrassed by the situation, but he began helping to pack their belongings rather than continuing to argue with the legal authorities. The children were understandably upset and confused by the sudden activity and the adults' emotional reactions. Sarah felt genuinely sorry for them and approached them calmly to explain that they would be moving to a new home but that everything would be okay. She gave each child a small gift and assured them that the problems between the adults were not their fault. David arrived home from work in the middle of this chaotic scene. He was completely shocked to see legal officials, a moving crew, and his family's belongings being loaded into a truck in the driveway. Sarah could see the confusion and hurt in his eyes as he tried to understand what was happening. Carmen immediately ran to David and began explaining that Sarah had called the police and was throwing the family out of the house. Carmen claimed that Sarah had acted without warning and had refused to discuss any reasonable compromises. She demanded that David intervene and force Sarah to cancel the eviction proceedings. However, Margaret Thompson approached David with copies of all the legal documents and explained exactly what was happening and why. Margaret made it clear that Sarah had every legal right to evict guests from her own property, and that Carmen's previous demands had been completely without legal foundation. Sarah watched David's face carefully as he processed this information. She could see him struggling to understand how the situation had escalated to this point and trying to decide how to respond. Sarah realized that David's reaction in this moment would determine the future of their marriage. David stood in the driveway holding the legal documents, his face cycling through expressions of confusion, shock, and growing realization. Sarah could see him reading Margaret Thompson's carefully prepared summary of events, which included detailed documentation of Carmen's demands, the family's behavior over the past months, and the legal basis for the eviction proceedings. As David read, Carmen continued her emotional appeals, grabbing his arm and insisting that Sarah had lost her mind and was trying to destroy their family. Carmen claimed that she had only been trying to help everyone find a reasonable solution, and that Sarah had overreacted to what should have been a simple family discussion. Maria joined her mother in pleading with David to intervene, pointing to her crying children and claiming that Sarah was being cruel and heartless. She accused Sarah of caring more about property than about family relationships, and suggested that David needed to choose between his wife and his blood relatives. However, as David continued reading the legal documents and observing the scene around him, a different picture began to emerge. He started to understand the full extent of his mother's demands and the manipulative tactics she had been using. He realized that Carmen had not been looking for reasonable compromises, but had been attempting to essentially steal his wife's property through intimidation and emotional blackmail. David also began to recognize his own role in allowing the situation to deteriorate to this point. He understood that his failure to set appropriate boundaries with his family and his reluctance to fully support Sarah had contributed to the crisis. He realized that his attempts to avoid conflict had actually made the situation worse and had left Sarah feeling abandoned and betrayed. Margaret Thompson approached David and offered to answer any questions he might have about the legal proceedings. She explained that Sarah had tried every reasonable approach to resolve the situation, and that legal action had only become necessary when Carmen had made demands that amounted to attempted theft of Sarah's property. Margaret also explained to David that his mother's claims about tenant rights and property ownership had been completely false, and that Carmen had apparently consulted with someone who had given her incorrect legal advice. Margaret suggested that Carmen had either been deliberately misled or had misunderstood legitimate legal information, and had then used that misinformation to justify her outrageous demands. As the reality of the situation sank in, David felt a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and deep sadness. He was angry at his mother for putting him in this impossible position and for treating Sarah with such disrespect. He was embarrassed that his family had behaved so poorly and had taken advantage of his wife's generosity. Most of all, he was sad that the situation had deteriorated to the point where legal action had become necessary. David walked over to Sarah, who was standing quietly near the front porch watching the moving crew finish loading the truck with Maria's belongings. He could see the pain and disappointment in her eyes, and he realized that his marriage was in serious jeopardy because of his failure to properly handle his family's behavior. David apologized to Sarah for not supporting her properly and for allowing his mother's behavior to continue unchecked. He acknowledged that he had been hoping to avoid conflict but had instead allowed a bad situation to become much worse. David told Sarah that he should have recognized Carmen's demands as completely inappropriate and should have immediately put a stop to her manipulative behavior. Sarah listened to David's apology with mixed emotions. She was glad that he finally understood the seriousness of the situation, but she was also hurt that it had taken legal action to make him recognize what had been obvious to her for months. Sarah realized that David's loyalty to his family of origin had temporarily overshadowed his commitment to their marriage, and she wondered whether she could trust him to prioritize their relationship in future conflicts. Carmen overheard David's apology to Sarah and became even more upset and angry. She accused David of betraying his own family and choosing an outsider over the mother who had sacrificed everything for him. Carmen claimed that Sarah had manipulated David and turned him against his own blood relatives, and she predicted that David would regret his decision for the rest of his life. David turned to face his mother with a firmness that Sarah had never seen from him before. He told Carmen that she had crossed every reasonable boundary and had shown complete disrespect for his wife and his marriage. David explained that Carmen's demands had been absolutely unacceptable, and that her behavior had forced Sarah to take legal action to protect her own property rights. David also addressed Maria directly, explaining that while he sympathized with her financial difficulties, it was not reasonable to expect Sarah to give up her own bedroom and potentially her house to accommodate Maria's family indefinitely. David pointed out that Maria and Roberto were adults who needed to take responsibility for finding their own housing solutions rather than expecting others to sacrifice for their benefit. Maria became defensive and accused David of abandoning his sister in her time of need. She claimed that family should stick together no matter what, and that David's loyalty should be to his blood relatives rather than to his wife. Maria suggested that if David truly cared about his family, he would convince Sarah to reconsider her position and allow them to stay in the house. However, David surprised everyone, including Sarah, with the strength of his response. He told Maria that his primary loyalty was now to his wife and their marriage, and that Carmen's demands had been so inappropriate that they had permanently damaged his relationship with his mother. David explained that while he would always love his family, he could not support behavior that was disrespectful and manipulative. David also announced that he would be limiting contact with Carmen until she acknowledged that her behavior had been wrong and apologized to Sarah for her demands and harassment. David made it clear that Carmen would not be welcome in their home until she demonstrated that she could treat Sarah with the respect she deserved as both his wife and the homeowner. Carmen was absolutely shocked by David's strong stance. She had expected him to eventually side with her against Sarah, and she had never imagined that her demands would result in David choosing his wife over his mother. Carmen's face went through a series of expressions as she processed this unexpected turn of events, moving from disbelief to anger to something approaching panic. Carmen made one final desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. She claimed that she was having chest pains and suggested that the stress of the confrontation was affecting her health. She dramatically placed her hand over her heart and leaned against the truck, hoping that David would rush to her aid and potentially reconsider his position. However, David had finally seen through his mother's manipulative tactics. While he was concerned about her well-being, he recognized the chest pain complaint as another attempt at emotional manipulation. David calmly suggested that if Carmen was truly experiencing medical issues, they should call an ambulance, but he made it clear that her health concerns would not change the legal proceedings or his support for Sarah's decision. Margaret Thompson intervened at this point and informed everyone that the eviction proceedings needed to continue regardless of the family drama. She explained that Maria's family had until the following morning to complete their move, and that any delay would result in additional legal complications. Roberto, who had been quietly loading belongings into the truck throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up and announced that they were nearly finished packing and would be leaving shortly. He apologized to Sarah for the disruption and acknowledged that the situation had gotten out of hand. Roberto's calm acceptance of the situation seemed to deflate some of Carmen's dramatic protests. As the moving truck pulled away with Maria's family and their belongings, Carmen found herself standing alone in the driveway facing the reality that her plan had completely backfired. Not only had she failed to secure better housing for Maria, but she had also potentially lost her relationship with her son and had been legally banned from visiting the house that had become her second home. Carmen made one last appeal to David, asking him to reconsider his position and to think about all the sacrifices she had made for him over the years. She reminded him of her struggles as a single mother and suggested that his current success was largely due to her dedication and hard work. David acknowledged his gratitude for everything Carmen had done for him, but he also explained that her past sacrifices did not give her the right to make unreasonable demands or to treat his wife with disrespect. David told Carmen that he loved her and would always appreciate what she had done for him, but that she needed to accept that his marriage came first and that Sarah deserved to be treated as an equal member of the family. Carmen realized that she had lost this battle completely. Her attempts to manipulate the situation had not only failed but had also resulted in serious consequences that she had not anticipated. Carmen gathered what remained of her dignity and announced that she would be staying with a friend until she could make other arrangements. Before leaving, Carmen made one final threat, suggesting that David would regret his decision and that Sarah's true nature would eventually be revealed. Carmen predicted that Sarah would continue to drive wedges between David and his family, and that David would ultimately realize that blood relationships were more important than marriage. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and sadness as she watched Carmen leave. She was glad that the immediate crisis had been resolved and that David had finally supported her position, but she was also sorry that the situation had deteriorated to the point where legal action had been necessary. Sarah had genuinely hoped to build a good relationship with David's family, and she felt disappointed that Carmen's behavior had made that impossible. In the days following the dramatic eviction, Sarah and David began the process of rebuilding their relationship and their household. The house felt strangely quiet after months of chaos and overcrowding, and both of them needed time to adjust to having their privacy and space restored. David took several days off from work to focus on his marriage and to demonstrate his commitment to making things right with Sarah. He spent time cleaning and repairing the damage that had been done to various rooms during Maria's family's stay, and he worked to restore the house to the peaceful sanctuary it had been before the Rodriguez family crisis. More importantly, David and Sarah had several long and difficult conversations about their relationship and their expectations for dealing with family conflicts in the future. David acknowledged that he had failed to protect Sarah from his mother's manipulative behavior, and that his attempts to avoid confrontation had actually made the situation much worse. Sarah explained to David how isolated and unsupported she had felt during the months of increasing pressure from his family. She described how Carmen's demands had made her feel like a guest in her own home, and how David's failure to immediately reject those demands had made her question his commitment to their marriage. Through these conversations, David gained a deeper understanding of how his family dynamics had affected his marriage. He realized that his mother had always been controlling and manipulative, but that he had learned to manage her behavior by avoiding confrontation rather than setting appropriate boundaries. David understood that this approach might have worked when he was single, but that it was completely inappropriate now that he was married and had obligations to his wife. Sarah, for her part, came to understand that David's loyalty to his family came from a place of love and gratitude rather than a lack of commitment to their marriage. She recognized that David had been caught between competing loyalties and that he had genuinely struggled to find a way to help his family without hurting their relationship. However, Sarah also made it clear to David that she expected him to prioritize their marriage in any future conflicts, and that she would not tolerate another situation where she felt unsupported or abandoned. Sarah explained that trust was something that needed to be rebuilt gradually, and that David would need to demonstrate his commitment through his actions rather than just his words. David readily agreed to Sarah's expectations and promised that he would never again allow his family to treat her with disrespect or make unreasonable demands. He also agreed to attend marriage counseling with Sarah to help them develop better communication skills and to ensure that they were fully aligned in their approach to family relationships. Meanwhile, the consequences of Carmen's failed manipulation continued to unfold throughout the extended family. Maria and Roberto had been forced to move in with Roberto's brother and his family, creating overcrowded conditions that were actually worse than what they had experienced in Sarah's guest room. The stress of their housing situation, combined with the family conflict, put additional strain on Maria and Roberto's already troubled marriage. Roberto finally found steady employment at a construction company, partly motivated by the urgency of their housing situation and the realization that they could no longer depend on others to solve their problems. However, the job required long hours and physical labor that Roberto was not accustomed to, and he struggled to adjust to the demands of his new position. Carmen found herself more isolated than she had been in years. Her dramatic behavior during the eviction had embarrassed her among friends and neighbors, and many people in her social circle had heard about the legal proceedings through the neighborhood gossip network. Carmen realized that her reputation in the community had been damaged by her attempts to manipulate Sarah and take advantage of the young couple's hospitality. More significantly, Carmen found herself cut off from regular contact with David for the first time since he had gotten married. David's decision to limit contact until Carmen apologized to Sarah left Carmen feeling lonely and regretful about the choices she had made. Carmen began to understand that her attempts to control the situation had actually resulted in her losing the relationship that was most important to her. Several weeks after the eviction, Carmen contacted David and asked if she could meet with him to discuss the situation. David agreed to meet with his mother, but he insisted that the meeting take place at a neutral location and that Sarah be included in any serious discussion about rebuilding their relationship. During this meeting, Carmen made a partial apology for her behavior, acknowledging that her demands had been inappropriate and that she had put David in an unfair position. However, Carmen still struggled to fully accept responsibility for her actions, and she continued to suggest that the situation could have been handled differently if everyone had been more willing to compromise. David recognized that Carmen's apology was incomplete and that she still did not fully understand how her behavior had been wrong. He explained to his mother that her demands had not been excessive requests that required compromise, but had actually been attempts to steal Sarah's property and manipulate the family through emotional blackmail. David also made it clear to Carmen that any future relationship would depend on her ability to treat Sarah with genuine respect and to acknowledge Sarah's rights as both his wife and the homeowner. David explained that he was no longer willing to manage Carmen's behavior through avoidance, and that she would need to take full responsibility for changing her approach to family relationships. Sarah participated in this meeting with some reluctance, as she was still hurt by Carmen's previous behavior and skeptical about Carmen's willingness to genuinely change. However, Sarah was committed to supporting David's desire to maintain a relationship with his mother, provided that Carmen could demonstrate appropriate respect and boundaries. Sarah made it clear to Carmen that any future relationship would start slowly and would depend on Carmen's ability to consistently demonstrate respectful behavior over time. Sarah explained that she was willing to forgive Carmen's previous actions, but that trust would need to be rebuilt gradually through Carmen's actions rather than her words. Carmen left this meeting with a better understanding of what would be required to rebuild her relationship with David and Sarah, but she still struggled with accepting full responsibility for her behavior. Carmen had spent years using emotional manipulation to get her way, and changing these deeply ingrained patterns would require significant effort and self-reflection. 3 months after the dramatic eviction, just as Sarah and David were beginning to feel like their marriage was back on solid ground, they received some unexpected news that would change their perspective on the entire situation. Elena, Sarah's mother, called with information that she had discovered about Carmen's background and motivations that shed new light on the family conflict. Elena explained that she had been conducting some business research that had led her to discover some surprising information about Carmen's financial situation. Through her connections in the real estate and business community, Elena had learned that Carmen was facing serious financial difficulties of her own and had been struggling to maintain her independence for several months. It turned out that Carmen had been laid off from her job at the insurance company where she had worked for over 15 years, and despite her claims about helping Maria research assistance programs, Carmen had actually been secretly applying for various forms of financial aid herself. Carmen's unemployment benefits had run out, and she was facing the possibility of losing her own small apartment due to unpaid rent. Elena's investigation revealed that Carmen's demands about Sarah's house had not been purely motivated by concern for Maria's family, but had also been partly driven by Carmen's own desperate housing situation. Carmen had apparently been hoping that if she could establish herself as a permanent resident in Sarah's house while helping care for Maria's children, she would have solved her own financial problems while maintaining the appearance of being helpful to her family. This revelation helped Sarah and David understand Carmen's behavior in a completely different context. While it did not excuse Carmen's manipulative tactics or inappropriate demands, it did explain the desperation and urgency that had driven her actions. Carmen had been facing her own crisis and had seen Sarah's house as a potential solution to multiple family problems at once. Elena also shared that her business contacts had mentioned seeing Carmen at various social services offices and legal aid clinics, apparently seeking advice about housing rights and tenant protections. This explained how Carmen had obtained the incorrect legal information she had used to justify her demands, and it suggested that Carmen had been planning her approach for several weeks before making her dramatic demands. Sarah felt a mixture of emotions upon learning this information. She felt sorry for Carmen's difficult financial situation and understood how desperation might have driven her to make poor decisions. However, Sarah also felt vindicated in her decision to take strong action, as it was now clear that Carmen's demands had been part of a calculated plan rather than spontaneous emotional outbursts. David was shocked to learn about his mother's hidden financial problems and felt guilty that he had not known about her struggles. He realized that Carmen's pride and her history of being the strong, independent provider for her family had prevented her from asking for help directly. Instead, Carmen had tried to solve her problems through manipulation and control, which had ultimately made her situation much worse. This new understanding prompted David to reach out to his mother and offer appropriate help with her actual problems. David and Sarah discussed the situation and agreed that they were willing to provide some financial assistance to help Carmen get back on her feet, but only if Carmen was willing to be honest about her situation and to approach the relationship with appropriate respect and boundaries. David contacted Carmen and offered to help her with her rent and job search, but he made it clear that this assistance was contingent on Carmen apologizing to Sarah and committing to respectful behavior in the future. David explained that he understood Carmen had been dealing with her own difficulties, but that her attempt to solve those problems by taking advantage of Sarah had been completely unacceptable. Carmen was initially resistant to accepting help from David and Sarah, as her pride made it difficult for her to admit that she needed assistance. However, the reality of her financial situation eventually forced her to set aside her pride and accept David's offer of support. More importantly, learning that David and Sarah knew about her financial struggles helped Carmen understand that her manipulative behavior had been transparent and unsuccessful. Carmen realized that her attempts to appear strong and in control while secretly planning to take advantage of others had been both dishonest and ultimately self-defeating. This realization prompted Carmen to make a more genuine apology to Sarah. Carmen acknowledged that her demands had been inappropriate and that she had let her own desperation drive her to treat Sarah badly. Carmen admitted that she had been jealous of Sarah's financial security, and had resented the fact that Sarah's mother had been able to provide such generous support. Carmen also acknowledged that she had never given Sarah a fair chance to be part of the family, and that her own preconceptions and prejudices had prevented her from recognizing Sarah's genuine kindness and generosity. Carmen expressed regret that her behavior had damaged her relationship with David and had created unnecessary conflict within the family. Sarah was moved by Carmen's more honest and complete apology, and she was glad to finally understand the full context of Carmen's behavior. While Sarah could not immediately forget the stress and hurt that Carmen had caused, she was willing to begin the process of rebuilding their relationship on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. David was relieved to finally have all the information about his family situation and to be able to address the real problems rather than just managing the symptoms. He helped Carmen find new employment through his professional connections and provided temporary financial assistance to help her maintain her independence while she got back on her feet. The family also worked together to find more appropriate help for Maria and Roberto, including job placement assistance for Roberto and childcare support that would allow Maria to work more hours. David and Sarah provided some financial assistance to help Maria's family move into their own apartment, but they made it clear that this was a one-time gift rather than an ongoing obligation. As the autumn leaves began to fall, Sarah and David reflected on the dramatic events that had tested their marriage and ultimately made it stronger. The crisis had forced them to confront some fundamental issues about family loyalty, personal boundaries, and the importance of mutual support in marriage. David had learned valuable lessons about the difference between helping family members and enabling their poor behavior. He came to understand that his previous approach of avoiding confrontation had actually been harmful to everyone involved, including his mother and sister. David realized that setting appropriate boundaries was not about being mean or uncaring, but about establishing healthy relationships based on mutual respect. Sarah had learned about the importance of standing up for herself and not allowing others to take advantage of her kindness and generosity. She understood that her willingness to help others was a positive quality, but that she needed to establish clear limits to prevent people from exploiting her good nature. The couple had also gained a deeper appreciation for the importance of open communication in their marriage. They realized that David's tendency to avoid difficult conversations and Sarah's reluctance to express her concerns directly had allowed small problems to grow into major crises. Sarah and David decided to continue with marriage counseling even after their immediate crisis had been resolved. They wanted to develop better skills for handling future challenges and to ensure that they maintained the strong foundation they had rebuilt after the family conflict. The counseling sessions helped them establish clearer expectations about their roles and responsibilities as a married couple, and they developed strategies for dealing with extended family relationships in ways that protected their marriage while still allowing them to maintain appropriate connections with their relatives. Carmen's situation gradually improved over the following months. With David's help, she found a new job that actually paid better than her previous position, and she was able to stabilize her financial situation. More importantly, Carmen began attending counseling sessions of her own to address the controlling and manipulative patterns that had damaged her relationships with her children. Through counseling, Carmen came to understand how her own difficult childhood and the challenges of single parenthood had led her to develop unhealthy approaches to family relationships. Carmen learned that her attempts to control situations and people around her had been driven by fear and insecurity rather than love and concern. Carmen also worked on developing a more genuine relationship with Sarah, based on getting to know her as an individual rather than seeing her as a threat or competition. Carmen began to appreciate Sarah's intelligence, kindness, and strength, and she came to understand why David had fallen in love with her. The relationship between Carmen and Sarah developed slowly but steadily. They began meeting for coffee occasionally, and Carmen made genuine efforts to show interest in Sarah's jewelry business and other interests. Carmen also began treating Sarah as an adult equal rather than trying to manage or control her behavior. Maria and Roberto's situation also improved significantly once they were forced to take full responsibility for their own problems. Roberto's new job provided steady income, and Maria was able to increase her work hours once they found appropriate childcare for their children. The stress of their housing crisis and the family conflict had actually motivated both of them to make positive changes that they had been avoiding for years. Maria eventually apologized to Sarah for her role in the family conflict, acknowledging that she had allowed her mother to manipulate the situation and had not taken appropriate responsibility for her own family's problems. Maria expressed appreciation for the help that Sarah and David had provided and acknowledged that Sarah had been more generous and patient than the situation had required. The children, Sophia and Miguel, adjusted well to their new living situation once the adult conflicts were resolved. They were actually happier in their own apartment with their parents, and the stability of Roberto's employment had reduced much of the stress and uncertainty that had been affecting their behavior. David maintained a good relationship with his sister and her children, but he established clearer boundaries about the extent and nature of help he would provide in the future. David made it clear that he was willing to assist with genuine emergencies and to provide reasonable support, but that he would not enable dependence or irresponsible behavior. Sarah and David also worked together to establish policies for their household that would prevent similar situations from occurring in the future. They agreed on limits for how long guests could stay, expectations for behavior while staying in their home, and procedures for handling family requests for assistance. Most importantly, they committed to discussing any major decisions or changes as a team and to presenting a united front when dealing with extended family members. David promised Sarah that he would never again allow anyone to make her feel unwelcome or disrespected in her own home. As winter melted into spring, Sarah and David found their marriage stronger than it had ever been. The crisis they had weathered together had taught them valuable lessons about communication, trust, and the importance of standing together as a united partnership. Their home once again became the peaceful sanctuary it had been designed to be, filled with love, laughter, and the quiet contentment of two people who had chosen each other above all else. Sarah's jewelry business flourished during this period, partly because she now had the peace and space to focus on her creative work. She had converted the former guest room into a proper studio, complete with professional lighting and organized storage for her materials. The room that had once been the source of so much conflict had been transformed into a space of creativity and productivity. David threw himself into his architectural work with renewed passion, taking on challenging projects that allowed him to express his creativity while building a reputation for innovative design. His home life was now stable and supportive, which gave him the confidence to take professional risks and pursue more ambitious goals. The couple also began to explore new interests together, taking weekend trips to art galleries and craft fairs where Sarah could find inspiration for her jewelry designs and David could study interesting architectural details. They felt like they were rediscovering each other and building new layers of connection that went beyond their original attraction. In late spring, Sarah began experiencing some unusual symptoms that initially worried her. She felt unusually tired and had been experiencing some nausea, particularly in the mornings. After several weeks of these symptoms, Sarah decided to see her doctor for a checkup. The news that Sarah received from her doctor was both shocking and wonderful. She was pregnant. Sarah and David had been casually discussing the possibility of starting a family, but they had not been actively trying to conceive. The pregnancy came as a complete surprise, but it was a joyful one that filled both of them with excitement and anticipation. When Sarah told David the news, his face lit up with a joy that she had never seen before. David swept her into his arms and spun her around their kitchen, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. They had dreamed of this moment, but experiencing it in reality was more wonderful than either of them had imagined. The pregnancy news also brought a new perspective to their recent family conflicts. Sarah and David realized how important it was that they had established clear boundaries and a strong partnership before bringing a child into their family. They felt confident that they could provide their child with a stable, loving home environment where their marriage would always come first and their child would be protected from manipulative or unhealthy family dynamics. Sarah called her mother to share the exciting news, and Elena was overjoyed at the prospect of becoming a grandmother. Elena immediately began making plans to support Sarah throughout her pregnancy and to help prepare for the baby's arrival. Elena also expressed satisfaction that Sarah and David had worked through their family difficulties and were now ready to focus on building their own family unit. David was more hesitant about sharing the pregnancy news with his mother, given their recent conflicts and the ongoing process of rebuilding their relationship. However, Sarah encouraged David to tell Carmen, feeling that the prospect of a grandchild might provide a positive focus for their healing relationship. When David called Carmen to share the news, her reaction was everything they had hoped for. Carmen was thrilled at the prospect of becoming a grandmother and immediately asked how she could help and support Sarah during her pregnancy. Carmen's genuine excitement and focus on Sarah's well-being demonstrated how much their relationship had improved over the past year. Carmen asked David if she could take Sarah out for lunch to celebrate the pregnancy and to discuss how she could be helpful without being intrusive. This request showed remarkable growth in Carmen's understanding of appropriate boundaries and her recognition that Sarah should be treated as the primary decision-maker regarding her own pregnancy and childcare choices. Sarah was touched by Carmen's thoughtful approach and agreed to the lunch meeting. During their meal together, Carmen expressed sincere appreciation for the opportunity to be part of the baby's life and asked Sarah what kind of support would be most helpful. Carmen also shared some stories about David's early childhood and expressed excitement about the prospect of watching him become a father. This lunch marked a turning point in Sarah and Carmen's relationship. For the first time, they were able to connect as two women who both loved David and wanted what was best for his family. The prospect of a shared grandchild gave them common ground and a shared interest that transcended their previous conflicts. Carmen also used this opportunity to share some wisdom she had gained through her own counseling sessions. She talked about the mistakes she had made in trying to control her adult children's lives and her recognition that love meant supporting their choices rather than trying to direct their decisions. Carmen expressed hope that she could be a positive influence in the baby's life without repeating the patterns that had caused so much conflict. Maria was also excited about the prospect of a new cousin for her children, and reached out to Sarah to offer her congratulations and support. Maria had learned valuable lessons from her own recent struggles, and she was determined to approach this new family development with appropriate respect and boundaries. The entire extended family seemed to understand that this pregnancy represented a fresh start and an opportunity to build healthier relationships based on mutual respect and love rather than manipulation and control. Everyone was committed to ensuring that Sarah felt supported and respected throughout her pregnancy and beyond. As Sarah's pregnancy progressed through the summer months, the transformation in her relationship with David's family continued to amaze everyone involved. Carmen had become genuinely helpful and supportive, offering practical assistance like helping to prepare the nursery and sharing useful advice about pregnancy and childcare without being pushy or controlling. The nursery project became a bonding experience for the whole family. David designed a beautiful room that combined functionality with whimsical touches that would stimulate a baby's developing mind. Sarah chose colors and decorations that created a peaceful, nurturing environment. Carmen contributed by hand sewing beautiful curtains and a matching quilt, skills she had developed years earlier but had not used in quite some time. Even Maria got involved, offering to host a baby shower and helping Sarah register for baby supplies. The shower became a celebration of the family's healing and growth, with women from both sides of the family coming together in genuine harmony and joy. Elena was thrilled to see how the family dynamics had improved, and was especially pleased to see Sarah looking so happy and relaxed as her pregnancy progressed. Elena had been concerned that the stress from the previous year's conflicts might have lasting effects on Sarah's well-being, but instead she saw her daughter glowing with contentment and excitement about the future. As autumn arrived, Sarah was in her third trimester and feeling increasingly excited about meeting their baby. The doctor had told them they were having a boy, and David was over the moon at the prospect of having a son to teach about architecture, sports, and all the things he had learned from his own father figure, who had been a kind neighbor during his childhood. David had been attending every doctor's appointment with Sarah and reading every parenting book he could find. He was determined to be the kind of father who was actively involved in every aspect of his child's life, and he spent hours talking to Sarah's belly, telling their son about the world he would soon enter. One evening in October, as Sarah and David were putting finishing touches on the nursery, Sarah went into labor 3 weeks earlier than expected. David remained calm and supportive, timing contractions and gathering the hospital bag they had prepared weeks in advance. The labor was long but without complications, and at dawn on October 15th, Samuel David Rodriguez was born, weighing 6 pounds and 8 ounces. Samuel was a perfect baby with his father's dark hair and his mother's delicate features, and both parents fell in love with him instantly. David called his mother from the hospital to share the news, and Carmen immediately asked if she could visit to meet her grandson. When Carmen arrived at the hospital, she brought flowers for Sarah and a small teddy bear for Samuel that she had purchased on her way. Carmen's behavior at the hospital was exemplary. She focused entirely on Sarah's comfort and well-being, asking if there was anything she could do to help and expressing genuine admiration for how well Sarah had handled the birth. Carmen held Samuel gently and carefully, tears streaming down her face as she told him how much she loved him and how proud she was of his parents. Maria and her children also visited the hospital, bringing balloons and cards they had made to welcome their new cousin. Sofia and Miguel were fascinated by the tiny baby and promised to be the best older cousins they could be. Elena arrived from out of town that evening, having driven through the night to meet her grandson as soon as possible. Elena was moved to tears by the sight of her daughter holding her own child, and she spent hours just sitting quietly in the hospital room, marveling at the miracle of new life and the circle of family love. The first few weeks at home with Samuel were an adjustment for Sarah and David, but they were supported by family members who had learned how to help appropriately. Carmen offered to bring meals and help with household tasks without being asked, and she always checked with Sarah before making any suggestions or taking any actions. Elena provided practical support by helping with grocery shopping and errands, allowing Sarah and David to focus on bonding with their new son and adjusting to their new routine. Maria occasionally stopped by with her children, but she was careful to keep visits brief and focused on supporting the new parents rather than expecting entertainment or attention. The experience of becoming parents deepened Sarah and David's appreciation for the boundaries they had established and the work they had done to strengthen their marriage. They felt confident in their ability to make decisions together and to protect their family's well-being from any external pressures or manipulations. Samuel proved to be a remarkably content baby, sleeping well and showing early signs of the calm, observant nature that both his parents possessed. David was a natural father, taking turns with nighttime feedings and diaper changes without complaint, and spending hours just holding and talking to his son. Sarah marveled at how much her life had changed in such a short time. Just 2 years earlier, she had been dealing with the stress and conflict of Carmen's demands and feeling uncertain about her marriage's future. Now she was a mother, surrounded by family members who genuinely supported and respected her, and married to a man who had proven his commitment to putting their relationship first. The jewelry business that had once been Sarah's primary creative outlet evolved into something she could pursue part-time while focusing on motherhood. Sarah found that her experiences with conflict resolution and standing up for herself had actually improved her business skills, and she was able to be more assertive with customers and vendors. David's architectural career also flourished during this period. The confidence and stability he had gained from resolving his family conflicts translated into more creative and ambitious professional projects. David was selected to design several prominent buildings in the city, and his reputation as an innovative architect continued to grow. As Samuel approached his first birthday, the Rodriguez family had been completely transformed from the dysfunctional, manipulative group that had once threatened to destroy Sarah and David's marriage. The changes were so dramatic that sometimes Sarah had to remind herself that these were the same people who had once demanded that she give up her bedroom and potentially her house. Carmen had become the kind of mother-in-law that Sarah had always hoped to have. She was supportive without being intrusive, helpful without being controlling, and loving without being possessive. Carmen had learned to channel her strong personality and natural leadership abilities into positive directions, becoming an advocate for Sarah and David rather than an adversary. Carmen had also found renewed purpose in her role as grandmother. She babysat Samuel occasionally, but only when specifically asked, and she always followed Sarah's instructions about feeding, napping, and playtime activities. Carmen delighted in teaching Samuel simple songs and games, and she was building a treasure trove of memories with her grandson that brought her tremendous joy. The relationship between Sarah and Carmen had evolved into a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared love for David and Samuel. They often went shopping together for baby supplies or just to spend time talking, and Carmen had become one of Sarah's most trusted advisors on parenting questions. David observed these changes with amazement and gratitude. He had never imagined that his mother could change so dramatically, and he was proud of both Carmen and Sarah for their willingness to work past their conflicts and build something positive together. David felt like he finally had the unified, supportive family he had always wanted but had never known how to create. Maria had also made significant positive changes in her life. Roberto's steady employment had provided the financial stability their family needed, and Maria had been able to return to school to complete a degree in early childhood education. Maria's new career path was fulfilling and provided additional income that allowed their family to thrive rather than just survive. Maria's children, Sofia and Miguel, had blossomed in their stable environment. Sofia was excelling in school and showing artistic talents that reminded everyone of Sarah's creativity. Miguel was developing into a confident, outgoing child who adored his baby cousin Samuel and loved playing the role of protective older cousin. The extended family gatherings that had once been sources of tension and conflict had been transformed into joyful celebrations of their shared love and connection. Holiday meals were now pleasant affairs where everyone contributed something positive, and no one tried to control or manipulate the proceedings. Elena watched these developments with deep satisfaction. Her daughter had not only survived a serious threat to her marriage, but had emerged stronger and more confident than ever before. Elena was proud of Sarah's courage in standing up for herself, and her wisdom in eventually allowing the family relationships to heal and grow. Elena had also developed a friendship with Carmen based on their shared desire to support their children's marriage and their mutual adoration of Samuel. The two grandmothers coordinated their visits and gifts to avoid overwhelming the new parents, and they often consulted with each other about ways to be helpful without being intrusive. As Samuel's first birthday approached, Sarah and David decided to host a party that would celebrate not only their son's milestone but also the incredible journey their family had traveled together. They invited everyone who had been part of their story, including Margaret Thompson, the attorney who had helped Sarah protect her rights during the crisis. The party was held in the backyard of the house that had once been the center of so much conflict but had now become a true family home filled with love, laughter, and security. Samuel toddled around the yard, delighting in the attention from his extended family and showing off his new walking skills to anyone who would watch. During the party, Carmen asked if she could make a toast to Samuel and his parents. Standing in front of the gathering, Carmen spoke about the lessons she had learned over the past 2 years and the gratitude she felt for Sarah's forgiveness and David's patience. Carmen acknowledged that she had once made serious mistakes that could have destroyed the family, but that everyone's willingness to work toward healing had created something more beautiful than what they had started with. Carmen also spoke directly to Sarah, thanking her for teaching the family about boundaries, respect, and the importance of earning rather than demanding love and trust. Carmen said that Sarah had shown all of them what it meant to be strong and gracious at the same time, and that the family was better because of Sarah's courage and wisdom. Sarah was moved to tears by Carmen's words and by the recognition of how far they had all traveled together. She responded by thanking Carmen for her willingness to change and grow, and for becoming the loving grandmother and supportive mother-in-law that Sarah had always hoped to have. David spoke about the importance of family but also about the need for that family to be built on a foundation of respect and love rather than obligation and manipulation. He thanked Sarah for her strength during their most difficult period and credited her with teaching him how to be a better husband and son. As the party continued into the evening, with Samuel napping peacefully in his father's arms while the adults shared stories and laughter, Sarah reflected on the incredible transformation that had taken place. The demands that had once seemed so threatening and destructive had actually been the catalyst for positive changes that might never have occurred otherwise. Sarah realized that Carmen's shocking demands had forced everyone to confront unhealthy patterns and to make choices about what kind of family they wanted to be. The crisis had been painful at the time, but it had ultimately led to stronger relationships, clearer boundaries, and a deeper understanding of what it meant to love and support each other appropriately. Looking at her son sleeping peacefully in his father's arms, surrounded by family members who had learned to love and respect each other genuinely, Sarah felt grateful for every difficult moment that had led them to this place. The house that her mother had given her as a wedding gift had become more than just a physical shelter. It had become the foundation for a family built on trust, respect, and genuine love. The shocking demands that had once threatened to tear the family apart had instead become the beginning of a story about forgiveness, growth, and the power of standing up for what is right while remaining open to healing and change. Samuel would grow up in a family that had learned these lessons the hard way and would be able to teach him about both strength and compassion from their own hard-won experience. As the last guests departed and Sarah and David tucked Samuel into their crib, they reflected on how much their lives had changed and how grateful they were for every step of their journey together. The master bedroom that Carmen had once demanded Sarah vacate was now a peaceful sanctuary where Samuel's parents could rest and dream about their family's bright future, secure in the knowledge that they had built something lasting and beautiful together. 5 years after the dramatic confrontation that had nearly torn their family apart, Sarah stood in the same master bedroom, now preparing for another significant milestone. Samuel, now a bright and energetic 6-year-old, was getting ready for his first day of kindergarten, chattering excitedly about all the things he would learn and the friends he would make. The house had seen many changes over the years. Sarah's craft room had been converted into a proper office where she now ran a thriving online jewelry business that had grown far beyond her original dreams. David had been promoted to senior partner at his architectural firm and had designed several award-winning buildings that had earned him recognition throughout the region. The guest room that had once been the source of so much conflict now served as a proper guest room once again, occasionally hosting Elena during her visits or Carmen during planned overnight stays when she came to babysit Samuel. The room was decorated with cheerful colors and comfortable furniture, and it had become a welcoming space rather than a source of tension. Carmen had flourished in her role as grandmother, but she had also rebuilt her own independent life in remarkable ways. She had been promoted to supervisor at her new job and had purchased a small but comfortable condo near her workplace. Carmen dated occasionally and had developed a circle of friends who appreciated her strong personality and generous heart. Most importantly, Carmen had learned to channel her natural leadership abilities into volunteer work with a local organization that helped families facing financial crises. Carmen used her own experiences to help other families navigate difficult situations without resorting to manipulation or taking advantage of others. Her work was deeply fulfilling and allowed her to make positive contributions to her community. Maria had completed her degree and was now working as a lead teacher at a highly regarded preschool. Roberto had been promoted to foreman at his construction company, and their family had purchased their own modest but comfortable home in a good neighborhood with excellent schools. Sofia and Miguel were thriving academically and socially, and both children maintained close relationships with their extended family while understanding appropriate boundaries. The family gatherings that had once been sources of stress and conflict had evolved into cherished traditions that everyone genuinely looked forward to. Holiday celebrations were joyful affairs where everyone contributed to the preparation and cleanup, and disagreements were handled through respectful discussion rather than manipulation or emotional blackmail. Elena had become not just a grandmother to Samuel but a true matriarch who provided wisdom and guidance to the entire extended family. Elena's business continued to thrive, and she had established a college fund for Samuel that would ensure his educational opportunities regardless of any future financial circumstances. On this particular morning, as Sarah helped Samuel get ready for his big day, Carmen arrived early to take photographs and to drive Samuel to school alongside his parents. Carmen had asked permission to be part of this milestone moment, and Sarah had gladly agreed, appreciating Carmen's understanding of boundaries and her genuine desire to support the family. David emerged from his home office where he had been reviewing blueprints for a new community center he was designing. The project was particularly meaningful to him because it would serve families facing the same kinds of challenges that his own family had once navigated. David's experiences had given him a deeper understanding of how physical spaces could support healthy family relationships and community connections. As the family gathered in the kitchen for Samuel's special first day of school breakfast, Sarah marveled at the scene around her. Carmen was helping Samuel tie his new sneakers while telling him about all the wonderful things he would learn in kindergarten. David was packing Samuel's lunch and making sure his backpack contained all the necessary supplies. Elena had arrived with a special first day of school gift, a small wooden pencil box that she had carved with Samuel's initials. The conversation around the breakfast table was filled with laughter, encouragement, and genuine affection. Samuel was excited but a little nervous about starting school, and each family member offered their own words of wisdom and support. Carmen told him about how smart and kind he was and how the other children would be lucky to have him as a friend. Elena shared stories about Sarah's first day of school and how proud she was of the strong, confident boy Samuel was becoming. After breakfast, the entire family accompanied Samuel to school for his first day. As they walked through the halls of the elementary school, Samuel held hands with both his parents while his grandmothers followed behind, taking photographs and sharing in the excitement of this important milestone. Outside Samuel's classroom, Carmen gave him a gentle hug and whispered words of encouragement in his ear. Elena presented him with a special pencil box and told him how proud she was of him. David knelt down to Samuel's level and reminded him of all the things they had practiced about being kind to other children and listening to his teacher. Sarah was the last to say goodbye, holding Samuel close and telling him how much she loved him and how excited she was to hear about his day when he came home. As Samuel walked confidently into his classroom, waving goodbye to his family, Sarah felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. The family that had once been torn apart by conflict and manipulation had been transformed into a source of strength, support, and unconditional love. Samuel was growing up surrounded by adults who had learned valuable lessons about respect, boundaries, and the difference between healthy support and unhealthy control. As Sarah and David drove home after dropping Samuel at school, they talked about their hopes and dreams for their son's future. They wanted him to grow up confident in his worth, clear about his boundaries, and committed to treating others with respect and kindness. They also wanted him to understand that family love should never come with conditions or demands that compromise his integrity or well-being. That evening, when Samuel came home from his first day of school, he was bursting with stories about his teacher, his new friends, and all the things he had learned. The family gathered around the dinner table to hear about his adventures, and Carmen and Elena hung on every word as Samuel described his day. During dinner, Samuel asked his parents to tell him again about how they had met and fallen in love. It was a story he never tired of hearing, and Sarah and David were happy to share it once again. As they talked about their wedding and the beautiful house that grandmother Elena had given them as a gift, Samuel listened with wide eyes and asked if someday he might have a beautiful house too. David told Samuel that if he worked hard and made good choices, he could have whatever kind of life he dreamed of. Sarah added that the most important thing was not the size or cost of the house, but the love and respect that the people inside showed to each other every day. Carmen, who had been listening quietly to this conversation, spoke up and told Samuel about the importance of treating everyone with kindness and respect, especially the people we love most. Carmen explained that sometimes adults make mistakes and hurt people they care about, but that it was always possible to say sorry, make changes, and build something even better than what existed before. Samuel nodded seriously as he listened to his grandmother's words, and then he asked if that was why everyone in their family was so happy together. Sarah and David exchanged glances across the table, both of them marveling at their son's intuitive understanding of the family dynamics around him. Elena smiled and told Samuel that their family was happy because everyone had learned to love each other the right way, with respect and kindness and healthy boundaries. She explained that love was not about demanding things from other people or trying to control them, but about supporting their happiness and helping them become the best versions of themselves. As the evening wound down and Samuel was tucked into bed, Sarah stood once again in the master bedroom that had been at the center of so much conflict years earlier. The room was peaceful and comfortable, decorated with family photographs that told the story of their journey together. David joined Sarah at the window that looked out over their backyard, where Samuel's swing set stood beneath the mature oak trees that had been there when they first moved into the house. They could see the garden that Sarah had planted during their early years of marriage, now mature and flourishing, with new additions that had been added each year as their family had grown and changed. Sarah thought about the young woman she had been when Carmen first made her shocking demands, and she realized how much she had grown and changed through the experience. She had learned to stand up for herself without becoming bitter or vindictive, to set boundaries without closing her heart to forgiveness and growth, and to fight for what was right while remaining open to healing and reconciliation. David reflected on his own growth over the years, recognizing how much he had learned about the difference between keeping peace and creating genuine harmony. He had discovered that real love sometimes required difficult conversations and firm boundaries, but that the relationships that survived those challenges became stronger and more authentic than those built on avoidance and superficial pleasantries. Together, Sarah and David had created something that neither of them could have achieved alone. They had built a marriage based on mutual respect and support, a family that valued both individual strength and collective harmony, and a home that truly reflected their values and dreams. The shocking demands that had once threatened to destroy their happiness had instead become the catalyst for transformation that had made their lives richer, deeper, and more meaningful than they ever could have imagined. The master bedroom that Carmen had demanded Sarah vacate had become the sanctuary where two people who truly understood the meaning of partnership could rest each night, grateful for the love they shared and the family they had built together. As Sarah and David prepared for sleep, they talked quietly about their plans for the weekend, Samuel's upcoming school events, and their hopes for the future. Their conversation was filled with the comfortable intimacy of two people who had weathered storms together, and had emerged stronger and more united than ever before. The house that Elena had given them as a wedding gift had become more than just a physical structure. It had become the foundation for a legacy of love, respect, and healthy relationships that would influence Samuel and future generations of their family. The shocking events that had once seemed so destructive had ultimately become the beginning of their most important story, a tale of courage, forgiveness, and the transformative power of standing up for what is right while keeping your heart open to growth and change. In the quiet of the master bedroom, surrounded by the peace and security they had fought so hard to protect and build, Sarah and David drifted off to sleep, grateful for every difficult moment that had led them to this place of contentment and looking forward to whatever adventures tomorrow would bring to their beautiful, imperfect, but deeply loving family.